Welcome back to the Haunted Lore, where we dive deep into the most chilling documented mysteries, urban legends, and true crime cases that have left investigators baffled and the public haunted by unanswered questions. Today, we're journeying to the frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains in Soviet Russia, where in February 1959, 9 experienced hikers met their deaths under circumstances so bizarre and unexplained that the case continues to spawn theories, investigations, and nightmares more than 6 decades later. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident, a case that begins as a simple winter hiking expedition and transforms into one of the most perplexing mysteries in modern history. What you're about to hear involves official government cover-ups, unexplained injuries that defied medical understanding, and evidence that seemed to point toward forces beyond conventional explanation. By the end of our journey today, you'll understand why this incident has become the gold standard for unsolved mysteries, inspiring countless books, documentaries, and theories that range from the plausible to the utterly terrifying. What led 9 experienced hikers to venture into the Siberian wilderness? Our story begins in late January 1959, when a group of 9 seasoned hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute prepared for what should have been a challenging but routine winter expedition. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student whose name would forever be linked to this tragedy. Dyatlov was no amateur. He was an experienced hiker and skier who had successfully completed difficult expeditions before. The team consisted of 8 men and 2 women, all in their early 20s, except for Alexander Zolotaryov, a 37-year-old World War II veteran who served as the group's most experienced member. These weren't weekend warriors or casual adventurers. Each member had been carefully selected based on their hiking experience and physical fitness. They had trained together, planned meticulously, and equipped themselves with the best gear available in 1950s Soviet Union. Their destination was Otorten, a mountain in the northern Urals whose name translates ominously to "don't go there" in the local Mansi language. The indigenous Mansi people considered this area sacred and warned outsiders away, though whether this was due to spiritual beliefs or practical knowledge of the region's dangers remains unclear. The expedition was planned as a Category 3 hike, the most difficult classification in the Soviet hiking system, and was intended to earn the participants a prestigious sports certification. The route they planned would take them through some of the most remote and harsh terrain in the Soviet Union. Winter temperatures in the region regularly dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, with brutal winds that could create life-threatening conditions in minutes. The group planned to be away for approximately 3 weeks, following a carefully mapped route that would take them deep into the wilderness, where rescue would be nearly impossible if something went wrong. What makes their preparation even more significant is that Igor Dyatlov had promised to send a telegram upon their return, scheduled for February 12th. This wasn't just a casual promise. It was a safety protocol that experienced hikers used to ensure someone would raise the alarm if they failed to return on schedule. Why did the search teams take so long to launch a rescue mission? When February 12th came and went without word from the Dyatlov group, their families and friends initially weren't alarmed. Delayed returns were common in winter expeditions due to weather conditions or minor setbacks. However, as days turned into a week, concern began to mount among the relatives and the hiking community at the Ural Polytechnical Institute. The delay in launching an official search reveals much about Soviet bureaucracy and attitudes towards civilian activities. The authorities initially dismissed the missing hikers as young people who had simply extended their adventure without proper communication. This wasn't entirely unreasonable. Communication from remote wilderness areas was nearly impossible in 1959, and experienced hikers often adjusted their schedules based on conditions. It wasn't until February 20th, more than a week after the planned return, that the first search teams were organized. Even then, the initial efforts were relatively modest, consisting of volunteer searchers from the Institute and local hiking groups. The Soviet military and professional rescue services didn't become involved until several more days had passed, when it became clear that this wasn't simply a case of delayed return. The search area was vast and unforgiving. The northern Urals in winter presented searchers with deep snow, extreme cold, and terrain that could conceal evidence for months. The volunteers who first ventured out were essentially looking for 9 people in thousands of square miles of wilderness, with no clear indication of where the group might have encountered trouble. When professional search teams finally mobilized, they brought aircraft, experienced trackers, and systematic search methods. However, the delay meant that crucial evidence might have been compromised by weather, and any survivors would have had to endure more than a week in conditions that were barely survivable, even with proper shelter and supplies. What did the searchers discover at the abandoned campsite? On February 26th, nearly 2 weeks after the hikers' planned return, searchers made the discovery that would launch decades of speculation and investigation. High on the slopes of what would later be renamed Dyatlov Pass, they found the remnants of the group's final campsite, a scene so disturbing and inexplicable that it immediately elevated this from a rescue mission to a criminal investigation. The tent was found partially collapsed and covered with snow, but what shocked the searchers was how the hikers had left it. The tent had been cut open from the inside, with large slashes that suggested the occupants had desperately tried to escape. These weren't small tears or damage from wind. They were deliberate cuts made by people inside the tent who were apparently so terrified or desperate that they chose to destroy their only shelter rather than exit through the normal entrance. Even more puzzling was the evidence of how quickly the hikers had fled. Personal belongings, including shoes, warm clothing, and essential survival gear, were left behind in the tent. In the brutal Siberian winter, leaving without proper footwear and clothing was essentially a death sentence, yet the physical evidence suggested that all 9 hikers had done exactly that. The campsite showed no signs of a struggle with other humans or animals. There were no footprints around the tent other than those of the hikers themselves, and no evidence that anyone else had been in the area. The tent was still partially standing, and the hikers' equipment was largely undisturbed, ruling out robbery or conventional attack as motives. What made the scene even more mysterious was the location itself. The hikers had chosen to camp on an exposed slope rather than in the sheltered forest below, which went against basic winter survival principles. Experienced hikers, like these, would have known better than to camp in such an exposed position unless something had prevented them from reaching better shelter. The footprints leading away from the tent told their own disturbing story. Searchers could follow the trail of 9 sets of prints leading down the slope toward a distant tree line. Some prints showed bare feet or socked feet, confirming that several hikers had fled into the deadly cold without proper footwear. The prints were relatively orderly, not suggesting panic or running, but rather a deliberate movement away from the tent in a single direction. How were the bodies discovered, and what did they reveal? The discovery of the bodies unfolded over several weeks, with each find adding new layers to the mystery. The first 2 bodies were found on February 27th, just 1 day after the tent discovery. Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko were discovered near the tree line, approximately 1.5 miles from the abandoned campsite. They were found beside the remains of a small fire, dressed only in underwear, and both had died from hypothermia. The location of these first bodies provided important clues about the group's final hours. The hikers had clearly made it to the forest and had attempted to build a fire for warmth, broken branches, and evidence of climbing on a nearby cedar tree suggested they had tried to gather fuel and possibly gain a vantage point to see back toward their campsite. The fact that they had managed to start a fire indicated they retained some survival instincts and capabilities, even after fleeing their shelter. 3 more bodies were discovered in the following days, found at various points along the route between the cedar tree and the original campsite. Igor Dyatlov himself was found on March 5th, positioned as if he had been trying to return to the tent. Zinaida Kolmogorova was discovered nearby, and Rustem Slobodin was found further up the slope. All 3 had died from hypothermia, and their positions suggested they had been attempting to return to their campsite, possibly to retrieve supplies or shelter. These discoveries painted a picture of the group's final hours that was both tragic and puzzling. After fleeing the tent, the hikers had split up. Some had remained at the fire site, while others had attempted to return to their equipment. The pattern suggested some level of organization and decision-making rather than pure panic. Yet the fundamental question remained: what had driven them from their shelter in the first place? The search for the remaining 4 bodies would prove even more challenging and would yield discoveries that transformed the incident from a tragic hiking accident into something far more sinister and unexplained. What happened to the final 4 hikers, found months later? The mystery deepened dramatically when the final 4 bodies were discovered on May 4th, more than 2 months after the initial search began. These bodies were found in a ravine approximately 300 feet from the cedar tree, buried under several feet of snow. Unlike the first 5 victims who had died from exposure, these 4 hikers had suffered traumatic injuries that defied easy explanation. The condition of these bodies immediately elevated the investigation to a new level of concern and confusion. Lyudmila Dubinina had severe chest injuries, including fractured ribs and internal bleeding. Alexander Zolotaryov had similar chest trauma, while Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered a major skull fracture. The 4th member of this group, Alexander Kolovatov, showed less severe injuries, but still had signs of significant trauma. What made these injuries particularly disturbing was their nature and severity. The medical examiner noted that the force required to cause such damage would have been enormous, comparable to a car crash or explosion. Yet there were no external wounds, cuts, or bruises that would typically accompany such severe internal trauma. The injuries appeared to have been caused by intense pressure or impact, but from an unknown source. Even more puzzling was the discovery that Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue and eyes, while other soft tissues were also absent. Initially, this seemed to suggest some form of attack or mutilation, but forensic experts later determined that this was likely due to natural decomposition and scavenging by small animals during the months the bodies had remained undiscovered. The location where these 4 bodies were found also raised questions. They were discovered in a small ravine that had been carved by running water, suggesting they might have sought shelter there. Some of the clothing found with the bodies showed higher than normal levels of radioactivity, though the significance of this finding remains debated. The radioactivity wasn't immediately lethal, but its presence added another layer of mystery to an already incomprehensible situation. What did the official investigation conclude, and why was it classified? The Soviet investigation into the Dyatlov Pass Incident was conducted with the seriousness typically reserved for matters of national security. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was an experienced prosecutor who had handled numerous criminal cases, but he would later admit that this investigation challenged everything he thought he knew about forensic science and criminal investigation. The official conclusion, reached after months of investigation, was deliberately vague and unsatisfying. The final report stated that the hikers had died due to a compelling natural force that had caused them to leave their tent and ultimately led to their deaths. This conclusion was remarkable for what it didn't say. It made no attempt to identify what this natural force might have been or how it had caused the specific injuries found on the victims. What made the official conclusion even more suspicious was the decision to classify the case files and restrict access to the incident site. The area around Dyatlov Pass was closed to hikers and researchers for 3 years following the incident, an unprecedented step that suggested the authorities were concerned about more than just safety. When asked about this decision years later, officials provided conflicting explanations that only fueled more speculation. Investigator Lev Ivanov's own statements about the case evolved over the years, and in interviews conducted decades later, he made cryptic references to pressure from higher authorities to end the investigation quickly. He mentioned being instructed to focus on natural causes and to avoid pursuing certain lines of inquiry that might have led to more controversial conclusions. The classification of the case files meant that crucial evidence and witness testimony remained hidden from public scrutiny for decades. When portions of the files were finally released in later years, they contained significant gaps and redactions that suggested information had been deliberately withheld or removed. The pattern of secrecy surrounding the case has persisted even into the modern era, with Russian authorities continuing to limit access to some materials. What theories have emerged to explain the unexplainable? The inadequacy of the official explanation and the bizarre nature of the evidence has generated numerous theories attempting to explain what really happened on Dyatlov Pass. These theories range from the scientifically plausible to the wildly speculative, but each attempts to address the fundamental questions that the official investigation left unanswered. One of the most widely discussed theories involves a rare weather phenomenon known as a katabatic wind. These powerful downdrafts can occur in mountainous regions and can generate wind speeds of over 100 miles per hour with little warning. Proponents of this theory suggest that such winds could have damaged the tent, created terrifying noises, and forced the hikers to flee. However, critics point out that katabatic winds typically don't explain the specific injuries found on the victims or the organized nature of their flight from the campsite. Another theory focuses on military testing in the region. The northern Urals were known to be used for various Soviet military exercises and weapons testing during the 1950s. Some researchers have suggested that the hikers might have inadvertently encountered a military test, possibly involving experimental weapons or aircraft. This theory gains some credibility from witness reports of strange lights in the sky around the time of the incident, though the military has never acknowledged any connection to the case. The avalanche theory has been both popular and controversial among researchers. In 2020, a team of scientists used advanced computer modeling to suggest that a rare type of avalanche, called a slab avalanche, could have struck the tent hours after the hikers had set up camp. This delayed avalanche could have prompted the immediate evacuation of the tent and explained some of the injuries. However, the original search teams found no evidence of avalanche activity, and the tent's relatively undamaged condition seems inconsistent with a major snowslide. More exotic theories have proposed everything from encounters with indigenous people protecting sacred sites to paranormal phenomena or even extraterrestrial contact. While these theories often struggle with the available evidence, they reflect the profound sense that conventional explanations fail to account for all aspects of the case. Why does the Dyatlov Pass incident continue to haunt us today? The enduring fascination with the Dyatlov Pass incident stems from more than just its mysterious circumstances. The case represents a perfect storm of factors that continue to resonate with modern audiences: unexplained deaths, government secrecy, scientific anomalies, and the fundamental human fear of the unknown. Part of the incident's lasting impact comes from the quality of the victims themselves. These weren't reckless adventurers or inexperienced hikers who made fatal mistakes. They were intelligent, well-prepared individuals who had taken reasonable precautions and followed established safety protocols. The fact that experienced outdoors people could meet such a fate in circumstances that remain unexplained challenges our assumptions about human knowledge and control over our environment. The technological limitations of 1959 also contribute to the mystery's persistence. Modern hikers carry GPS devices, satellite communicators, and weather monitoring equipment that might have provided crucial information about what the Dyatlov group experienced. The absence of such technology means we must rely on physical evidence and witness testimony, leaving significant gaps in our understanding of the incident's timeline and the hikers' final experiences. The case has also been kept alive by advances in forensic science and investigation techniques. Each new generation of researchers brings fresh analytical tools and perspectives to the evidence, occasionally uncovering new details or challenging previous assumptions. However, these advances have also highlighted how much evidence was lost or compromised in the original investigation, creating frustration among those seeking definitive answers. The incident has inspired numerous books, documentaries, films, and even video games, each offering different interpretations of the events. This cultural impact has introduced the case to new audiences worldwide, ensuring that interest in solving the mystery continues across generations and national boundaries. The Dyatlov Pass Incident remains one of the most compelling, unsolved mysteries of the modern era, a case where every answer seems to generate new questions and every theory leaves crucial elements unexplained. 9 experienced hikers entered the Siberian wilderness on what should have been a challenging but routine expedition, and instead became part of a mystery that has puzzled investigators, scientists, and amateur sleuths for more than 6 decades. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the mysterious circumstances of the deaths, but the way it challenges our understanding of how such tragedies unfold. The evidence suggests that something drove these experienced outdoors people to make decisions that were completely contrary to their training and survival instincts. Whether that something was a natural phenomenon we don't fully understand, human intervention that was covered up, or forces beyond conventional explanation, we may never know with certainty. The families of the 9 hikers have lived with questions that may never be answered, and their loss reminds us that behind every mystery are real people whose lives were cut short in circumstances that their loved ones struggle to comprehend. While we may be fascinated by the puzzle they left behind, we should never forget that their story is ultimately one of human tragedy. As new evidence occasionally emerges and modern technology offers new ways to analyze old data, the Dyatlov Pass incident continues to evolve. Perhaps someday we'll have a definitive explanation for what happened on that frozen mountain slope in February 1959. Until then, it remains a reminder that there are still mysteries in our world that defy easy explanation, and that sometimes the most terrifying enemy is the unknown. That's all for today's episode of The Haunted Lore. If you found this episode into the Dyatlov Pass incident as fascinating and unsettling as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. We'll continue to explore the darkest corners of documented history, urban legends, and true crime cases that have left investigators baffled and the public haunted by unanswered questions. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that sometimes the truth is stranger and more terrifying than any fiction we could imagine.